We're featuring a series of programs that really focus not just on Latino presence in American art, but the Latino presence in Chattanooga. And today is one of those programs, and we're so excited. Coming to America has done just tremendous things in such a short time here in Chattanooga. So we were really grateful to have the opportunity to partner with them to share these stories. You see the visual stories upstairs, and today you'll get to hear the personal stories of people who live within our community. So with that, I will invite up Victoria and Daniela to start us off.
Hola a todas, a todos, estamos muy contentos y contentas de estar acá, principalmente porque podemos hablar en español en esta institución. Estamos contentos de hacer eso, estamos contentos de tener una presencia acá y de tener un quinto evento.
Hi everyone, welcome to our fifth event. This one is at the Hunter, and we are very grateful, happy, and a little emotional that we are having the privilege to tell our stories, and not only that, be able to speak in Spanish at such a institution.
¿Quién eres?
We are coming to America. I also have to give a shout out to Sasha, Felipe, and Paul. If you guys can raise your hands and have everyone give them a round of applause. We're a storytelling collective that in general, we focus on immigrant stories, refugee stories, asylum seeker stories for people coming to the United States. It's usually not Latin, Hispanic centric. However, in honor of this exhibit, we are only going to be focusing on South American, Central American stories.
Victoria is from Argentina. She's been here for 25 years, and she loves asado de cuero, so that's your homework. Okay.
Thank you, Danny. Hi, everyone. Where are you from? I've never been able to answer that question simply. Usually the response goes something like, do you want the long story or the short story? Well, since I've got you as a captive audience, I might as well tell you the long story. How long do I have? 8 minutes? Awesome. Oh, awesome. The truth is that I have never known life without being an immigrant. I was the first generation of my French family born in Argentina, which means I have always lived in a state of confusion, never having just one identity. Occurrences like my mother asking a waiter for un gato and my being terrified that she had just ordered a cat for dessert were pretty regular. She was mistranslating gâteau, which means cake in French, into Spanish, but my 4-year-old self was thoroughly worried that a skinned cat covered in chocolate would appear at the table. My story starts with my paternal grandfather. He was the first to move to Argentina from France after World War II. He was a young engineer and had been hired to work on the construction of a dam. After the project was over, he was eager to stay in Argentina. Coming from post-World War II France, that isn't such a surprise. France was a depressed country after World War II. People were buying food with the equivalent of food stamps and starting to rebuild after such a catastrophic war. While in Argentina, he found a country where food, land, and opportunity were plentiful. So after his first project there was over, he figured out a way to stay in Buenos Aires and became the director to French companies who had offices or operations in Argentina. He did very well for himself. He met my grandmother, also French, on a transatlantic flight between Buenos Aires and Paris. My grandmother was a stewardess in the 1950s. When I was young, I didn't really get how cool that was. I have been traveling since I was 3 months old, and by then air travel was common. It took some time for me to grow up and learn about aviation and in general the historical context. So I think she's a pretty, I would say, bad blank chick, if that makes sense. Anyhow, I digress. So my grandparents are now living in Argentina. They had my aunt. Okay, maybe she is technically the first one born in Argentina, but she left Argentina when she was 18 years old to move away from her parents and never went back. So for all intents and purposes, I don't count her. My father was born a couple of years later, but by that time there was an epidemic going around in Buenos Aires, so my grandmother went to deliver him in Paris. Fast forward 27 years, and my father meets my French mother in Brazil. He was working in Rio de Janeiro, and she was there on a long vacation after having broken up an engagement. That's another story for another day. Soon after that, my parents got married. They moved to Argentina, where my father got a job. My grandparents were still living there. And to give you some historical context, this was right around the end of about a 15-year military dictatorship. I was actually born a year after the military's lost power. Argentina was trying to reinvent herself, and by 1991, the inflation was so bad that you didn't know how much money you needed to go to the grocery store with. And in general, the country was in really bad shape. That's when my parents decided to move to Miami. Why Miami, you ask? Well, I think it's pretty random. And maybe it was the sunny weather, or the fact that it was only a 2-hour time difference from Buenos Aires, where my dad was still working. But I've stopped trying to understand that choice. As a side note, I'd like to point out that I say that we moved here very nonchalantly. You'll hear some other stories coming up later that will have a lot more of a difficult immigration story. Back then, I just wasn't aware of the privilege that I had that my parents were able to immigrate so smoothly to this country. They both held the equivalent of master's degrees and could afford the lawyer to help them navigate the endlessly complicated bureaucratic American immigration system. It is much later that I realized how lucky I was. Anyhow, we landed in Miami, which in hindsight wasn't the worst culture shock. I was surrounded by people and children that were of Latin American descent, and don't get me wrong, the 7-year-old me hated it. The truth was that coming from a metropolitan city like Buenos Aires to Miami, which was lacking, in my opinion, of vitality and culture that I had grown up with, as well as leaving our farm behind, was very difficult. But, you know, I tell you that I feel like my immigration story was hard and difficult, but the truth is it wasn't. I was super blessed to come from a family that had means, and I was able to go back to Argentina and France pretty much on every single vacation. I didn't have to leave a family behind not knowing if I would ever see them again. So it's, that's something that I cannot ever say how lucky I was, and I want to emphasize that. Anyway, when my parents decided to get divorced, I begged my mother for us to leave Miami. We looked at Paris and New York as options, but at that point we had green cards. So staying in the US was what made logical sense at that point, otherwise I would have lost our green card having tried to go to France. We settled on New York, and we moved there 2 weeks before September 11th. I finished high school in New York City and then went to school in Boston. Boston was the first time I seriously felt culture shocked. Some schools there are very international, but Boston College, where I went, was very waspy, white, New England. I then realized that having lived in cities like Miami and New York had made me never feel out of place. I had always been surrounded by other immigrants from all over the world. After college, I was desperate to move back to New York and be back with my people. It was around this time, around the time of my graduation, that it started hitting me how lucky and how privileged I was. I did not need to worry about my student visa lapsing. I did not need to worry about getting sponsored for a work visa. I didn't need to worry about having to go back home. I ended up getting a job in advertising in New York and was happy as a clam for about 5 to 6 years. During that time, I had the privilege of becoming an American citizen. And then eventually I was hit by this desire to get out of the hamster wheel that New York City can be. So I decided to move back to Miami to try to reconnect with my dad and figure out what I wanted to do next. I stayed there for about 2 years and realized that for many reasons that I did not like living there, many of those same reasons that from when I was a kid were still true. So I packed up my car and moved to Chattanooga to live in a small city surrounded by nature with awesome rock climbing. And then I fell in love and opened a bakery. As you can see, where are you from is not an easy question for me to answer. I feel like a New Yorker with an Argentinian soul and a French palate. The connotation of the question, where are you from, has also changed throughout my 25 years in the United States. When I was younger, I felt that people were genuinely curious and liked that I brought some cultural diversity. But nowadays, with the current political climate in the US and abroad, I find myself oftentimes feeling judged and unwelcomed when asked that question. This anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, and in general, anti-the other rhetoric and mentality that is taking place frankly scares the daylights out of me. As I mentioned to you, my grandfather made it against all odds. He was the last of 8 kids to be born into a poor family in rural southwestern France. He fought against the Nazis as part of the French resistance. He became an engineer, and then he moved to a country halfway around the world and became a successful, and it would be even fair to say wealthy businessman. I would call him actually the epitome of the American dream, even though he himself never immigrated to the United States. Well, on my father's 21st birthday, my grandfather received a bomb, and it was sent by an intelligentsia circle of revolutionaries who did not like that a foreigner had succeeded in their country. My grandfather lost his hands that day. Being a non-native person in the New World means that at some point our ancestors have either immigrated or were forced to come here. Who are we to forget that? We must have compassion for those who are looking to do the same and remember that they too are in search of a better life. So with that, I'd like to leave you with the question, do you know your family's journey to the US?